Luther's approach to Scripture. In the Middle Ages, the Church used the Scripture generally in two ways. One was as a resource for doctrine, and the other as instruction for morals. As a resource for doctrine, the Church approached the Scripture allegorically. So it sought to distill from the texts the eternal truths of doctrine, which could be then preserved by the Church. When it used the Scripture morally, it read the stories of Scripture as instructions in proper behavior. So, for instance, if you read a story about Jacob, it would be read to remind you that cheating is not a good way of life. And so the Scripture was distilled. It became a doctrine book and a rule book. When Luther became a monk, he was assigned a question by his order. It's quite famous. How does one find a gracious God? The purpose of this question was to help a young student become acquainted with the means of grace, the sacramental system of the Church, and so forth. When Luther started reading Scripture, he read it very much like other medieval students had read it, for morals and for doctrine. But he began to see another level of Scripture peeking through behind. He started discovering the power of Scripture, and particularly the graciousness of Scripture. The God of the Bible is not simply interested in how we behave, nor is the God of the Bible always preoccupied with doctrine. The God of the Bible engages a human community at several levels, and a lot of those levels are a lot of fun. And so Luther began hearing a level of language in the biblical word that was different than he was taught to look for. That level of language was promissory. The God of the Bible makes promises, and the God of the Bible keeps promises, and God's promises go right to the basics of life. So God made a promise to Abraham and Sarah. He called them out of Ur of the Chaldees, north of what is now Turkey, and brought them down to Israel. A wandering Aramean was my father. Jacob came from Ur of the Chaldees, or Abraham, and he believed that God had spoken a threefold promise to him: to make Abraham his belonging, to give him land, and to give him children. And so he and Sarah went south with this promise, believing it. And lo and behold, Sarah never had a child. And so it appeared for certain that the promise was not being kept. But God appeared to Abraham and Sarah, sent 3 angels. Sarah made lunch, and while she was making lunch, she heard the angels telling Abraham that they would return next year and she would have a child. This when she was in her 90s. In the words of the Scripture, it had ceased to be the way of a woman with her. She was incapable of having children. But the good Lord likes to raise the dead. He likes the impotent and the barren. And so Abraham and Sarah started thinking about going to the Mothers Club at school and taking up the responsibilities of family life. The God of the promise makes promises and keeps them. And so faith takes God at His word. holds fast, believes even against all the evidence, and rejoices in the goodness of God. This is the fun of the biblical word. There are all kinds of stories like this. Isaac, the child born of the promise, was named for Sarah's laughter when she heard she was going to bear a child. Isaac had a son named Jacob, who was one of the great cheaters in human history. It's a story of sinners and a story of saints, a story of people who have nothing to offer and people who are dynamic and powerful, but it's above all the story of God's faithfulness.